Welcome to Conversations with Peter Boghossian, and thank you so much, G, for joining us from Birmingham, from the home of the Industrial Revolution. And Christina, today's co-host, we appreciate it. G, tell us about, I absolutely love your X feed. I think it's phenomenal, truly phenomenal. Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you started compiling those lists.
Okay, so my background's in tech, and I worked sort of in web design originally, and then I sort of pivoted into search engine work, and I worked on Microsoft Bing. And what happened was, while I was working for Bing, I realized that a lot of the things I was trying to do were actually not going anywhere, because we were trying to give people the best information. But what I realized when I was working on this was that we could give people the best information, but they didn't actually want it. And so what would happen is that we would give people the best, we would give people the Pulitzer Prize winning reporting, we would give them the systematic reviews, the meta-analyses and all this, and they would just ignore it. And they would choose the gossip, the clickbait, all of that kind of stuff. And so I realized then that the bugs I was trying to fix were not in the technology. They were the bugs in the psychology. It was the malfunctions in the mind that I actually wanted to fix. And so I left the tech industry, and I decided to sort of focus on debugging the brain. So I sort of did a bit of work on cognitive biases, logical fallacies, and trying to work out how we can make people more rational. So I've done quite a lot of stuff there, but I won't bore you with all the stuff I've been doing.
Your work is almost done.
Oh, how I wish.
So Christina and I.
So that's basically brought me.
Yeah. So Christina and I were talking about something beforehand about a tweet that you made from Meta AI. Reed, could you pull that up too? About show me. You retweeted something. Show me pictures of So can you explain this to us? And Reed, scroll up through so people can see it.
Yeah. So this is basically about the kind of biases. It's a very interesting topic. The biases that we're currently seeing in large language models. We're seeing it not just in Meta AI. We're seeing it in Google Bard. We're seeing it in ChatGPT. We're seeing it in all these other different LLMs. And I think it's interesting because it's kind of like downstream of human biases. These AI biases are downstream of human biases. So they're trained usually on things like Wikipedia, New York Times, basically mainstream information sources. And so if we're getting a certain output from these large language models, then that shows that there's a bias in the culture. But also there is also the bias in the sort of people who are weighting the different sort of outputs. So there's two biases here. There's the bias in the information source, which is the bias in the culture itself. And there's the bias that's deliberately injected into the system by the people who are programming it. So I think what's interesting about this is that it's a good way of showing that, hang on a second, there is this kind of, what you might want to call it a woke bias or whatever, but a bias towards interpreting the world in terms of oppressors and victims. We see this quite a lot in LLMs. So this is, for me, this is proof that the culture is not sort of balanced, that it's skewed towards a certain narrative. The fact that we're getting these one-sided outputs from LLMs. This is one example. Some guy replied to me the other day saying, well, as if Mark Zuckerberg's going to be anti-Semitic. But the thing is, it's not controlled by Mark Zuckerberg. He doesn't have a say in these day-to-day decisions. This is a lot further down the sort of chain of command. And it's people there are a lot of activists who are in the AI space right now. And they are trying to make AI more equitable. They're trying to make it less racist. They're trying to make it less sexist, less transphobic. And so this is a good way of catching them in the act, because these biases are not put there. They don't just emerge naturally. They're obviously put there by humans. And so that's why I find it interesting.
I like what you said about the left being about social engineering. And this seems to be more evidence of that, and that could be a problem.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think one of the things with the left is it's about sort of trying to beat nature, trying to sort of take charge of nature and control nature and shape nature. And one of the ways that they try to do this is to sort of influence what ideas enter people's heads. And so, in the old days, it was about censorship. But now it seems, obviously there's still censorship now, but now it's more about controlling the narrative. It's more about shaping the narrative in ways that are sort of conducive to the social justice project. And one of the ways, obviously, to do this is through large language models, because they did it with Google, they did it with search engines. Even when I was working on Bing, there was this whole thing about social justice, about preventing the far right from having a voice. And the far right can mean anything you want, really. But like now, it's because search engines are gradually being superseded by LLMs. In the future, people are not going to be searching Google, they're going to be searching ChatGPT. And so it makes sense, if you want to control society, if you want to shape society and create this kind of perfect utopia, it makes sense to take charge of these LLMs now.
And it's going to backfire because people can see what's going on. I mean, the ones that are paying attention. And they're becoming more and more distrustful of the left. I think all of us are kind of evidence of that. I think all of us sort of originally kind of came from the left, and now we're just
homeless.
Yeah, politically homeless.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
it's true. Yeah.
The problem isn't that, and correct me if I'm wrong as I think about this, the problem isn't that people realize that the culture is skewing one way, or that AIs or LLMs, large language models, or search engines or what have you. The problem is that people don't think that's a problem. I mean, some people think it's a problem, and then this is architected by design. And what I can't understand is, why would anybody think that having kind of an intrinsic my side bias in the search engines, in the ways that we acquire knowledge, shouldn't neutrality be the best way to look at it? Because sooner or later you won't be in power. Or is the idea to just gain as much power as you can now, and hopefully it's the kind of the Orwell thing, he who controls the present controls the future?
So I think there's a difference here in the way that people see the information space. So you just said that, shouldn't we strive for neutrality? I think that the people who are trying to social engineer, I think they also want to strive for neutrality. And they believe that there is a bias in the system, just like we do, but they believe that the bias goes the other way. And so they're trying to correct that and create what they think is going to be neutral, but what their neutral is our bias to the left.
They think the ends justify the means too. They're willing to do things to achieve their goals that a lot of us are uncomfortable with.
Absolutely. But I think most of the people who are working in tech, who are working on this stuff, I think they don't sort of subscribe to a lot of this stuff, this postmodernist sort of stuff, this standpoint theory, all of that. I don't think they really think about that very much. I think they mainly just see it as just a goal. They're basically told, look, at the end of the day, there's a bias in the system. Systemic racism is, patriarchy, all of this stuff. And we've got to get rid of it because it's bad for the business and it's bad for us. If, obviously they don't want to be embarrassed. So, you could see it with Google, for instance, like they tried to implant sort of people of color in sort of Nazi Germany, and these pictures of like Nazis with black skin, because obviously this was a side effect of what they were trying to do, which was to create an equitable world. They saw it as, hang on a second, for so long, there's not been any representation for people, marginalized people, all this sort of stuff. So we need to take the step. Obviously, I'm like you on this. I disagree with what they're doing, but I think it's important to appreciate that they think that they're doing the right thing. They think that they're correcting biases in the system, and they think that we are the biased. They think we're the biased people, and that we are trying to sort of destroy their project, which is to create a fair and equitable world. And I think
Okay,
it's very important.
I have to push back on that because I don't think that's true.
Okay.
So is there a way to objectively adjudicate certain claims like black people in Nazi uniforms as not being historically accurate? The moment that you say that, then how one discharges one's primary mission, like if the I love that generated by AI. I love that image at the bottom. Isn't it the case that the moment one says that, then there's a right or wrong? Right? There were no black. Was that the Iron Cross there? I can say, but there were no black Nazis. At least as far as I know, I can't fathom that there were black Nazis. So
no, I agree with you. Yeah, I agree with you on that.
So you can try to put everything you want that's equitable, like you can try to change history or look at through a new lens, but the consequence of doing that is that you don't discharge your primary mission, which is to quickly and accurately provide information to the user, to the person who's doing the searching. So we can then say, from an objective standpoint, no matter how morally driven one is, that there's a misfiring, there's a misalignment between discharging those objectives and hence, I suppose, the fiduciary responsibilities that those employees have. Or if my thinking is in error, let me know.
No, I think you and I are in agreement here. I don't think we disagree at all. I think obviously that the whole thing with the Nazis of color is actually a side effect. It's not a deliberate sort of attempt by them to sort of change history or anything like that. It's just I think it's just a side effect of what they were trying to do. Obviously, a lot of the people that work on AI are not. It's the thing with AI is it's very, very complicated, and even the people who are experts on it don't understand what the outputs are going to be when they're trying to fiddle with the sort of weightings. And so I think it was actually an accident. I think it was genuinely an error, and it was a side effect of them overcorrecting what they were trying to do. So they were trying to create a balance, but they overcorrected.
I don't mean to give you a hard time here. Maybe I do just a little bit of a hard time, but like that whole thing about, the Jewish dude in the end chopping off the Arab's head, the Muslim guy's head, like I just have a hard time believing. And maybe it's like tech naivete. I have a hard time believing you wouldn't test that product beforehand, before you put it out. Like nobody's thought like, gee, maybe we should test this.
Well, I think it was tested, but the thing is, you can't test every eventuality. There's always going to be something that's going to slip by the net because it's so complicated and there's so many different combinations of outputs. So I think they did test it, but obviously these things, because of the size of these large language models, no human being can predict what's going to come out of them when and this is one of the reasons why it's such a tricky subject and why it's so dangerous as well.
We used to code, right?
Yeah,
I did too. That's what I started doing websites and stuff when I was like 11 or 12 coding.
Cool.
But it is really a trial and error process. Like sometimes you can change one letter and it just changes everything about.
Well, you miss a semicolon, which I always used to do. Yeah.
You two are so nice. You're like way nicer and ascribing positive motives to people than I am.
Well, this is
Well, I'm trying to be nice here because I could say a lot of nasty things about them, but I don't want to. I think it's best if we try to approach this from seeing it from their point of view so that we can better understand why they're doing what they're doing. I mean, because I think, because I've been condemning the woke and all that on Twitter since like 2017, I kind of took a break from it because I thought, what am I actually achieving? Nothing. I'm just alienating people that I'm trying to persuade. So I've tried to take a different tact. And look, I disagree with them on a lot. And I fundamentally, ideologically disagree with their entire project. But I just don't think that telling them that I disagree with them is going to change anything.
No, I agree. That's that's for sure true. That's for sure true.
And like I said, I think, in one of my recent tweets, I pointed out that a lot of the sort of most horrific events in history were caused by people trying to do good in the world.
Yeah. Good intentions.
Yes. Yeah. So when I say they've got good intentions, So when I say that they've got good intentions, I'm not complimenting them. I'm not saying that, oh, well, at least they've got good intentions. I'm not saying that. I'm saying they're dangerous because they've got good intentions.
Yeah.
That makes them extremely dangerous.
Yeah,
So.
Pinker talks about that too. Yeah, so I just find the whole thing I just find the whole thing fascinating. And full disclosure, I am not a coder like you two. I've never written a line of code since high school, and even then I don't even know what I was doing. I want to pull up so one of the things that you do that's fascinating to me is you make these lists, and I just find that they're so interesting. I always send them to my kids to read, which is really high praise indeed.
Yeah, wow. Thank you.
Yeah, they're just outstanding. So I was hoping we could go through those, if that's okay. Some of these.
Sure.
Christina, you want to read this one?
10 ways to avoid being fooled. In 10 tweets, I'll explain 10 heuristics that will make you smarter. Epistemic humility is number 1. Don't try to be right, try to be less wrong. Avoiding idiocy is easier to make a habit of than achieving genius. And by beginning from the position that you're somewhat wrong, you'll become more aware of your blind spots and find it easier to change your mind.
Talk to us.
Yeah. So just before we went on air, I actually tweeted something which is quite sort of relevant to this. I'll read out the tweet because it's linked to this. So basically, it's about the kinds of words that people use, and it says, "Don't say stochastic if you could just say random. Don't say Bayesian prior if you can just say assumption. Right. Using fancy words doesn't make you more convincing. It only draws attention away from what you're saying to the way you're saying it, making you less convincing." And I think it's linked to that epistemic humility, because that's what I originally tried to do. I tried to appear smart when I first started writing. And I used to use these long words because I wanted to be smart. So I was trying to impress people with my language. But I realized that what I was doing was I was just making myself more confusing to everybody. And so by trying to be smart, I ended up being stupid. And so I decided to take the opposite approach, which was to try to just not be stupid, And so what I did was I tried to talk clearly. I tried to write clearly.
Yes.
And that made me use simple words. So I took the opposite approach, and by doing that, I got a lot more readers. So
how old are you?
That's something I don't want to really say.
Okay, don't say it, but that comes with age. That's the kind of thing a wiser person would say, right? Whereas a younger person wouldn't say. I can say, I don't know about you, Christina. Christina and I just went to an event with Colin, but I can honestly say that I talk to on a fairly regular basis the smartest people in the Anglosphere. And I don't know a single person who uses language like this grad speak language, or, I mean, Christina, correct me if I'm wrong, if you know them. Everyone is just so plainly spoken.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I try to do with my communication about gender issues too, is trying to make it as simple as possible for a layperson to understand. That's what these mega threads are so great, because you whittle down these complex ideas into something just easy for people to digest quickly. I think it's just, if you can be an effective communicator and get your point across to more people, that's way better than writing something with jargon that people don't understand.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. I think just trying to avoid errors is so much easier than trying to do something exceptional, trying to be a genius. Mm-hmm. I find that I behave much more intelligently when I do that. So that's why I think it's a rule that I think everybody should follow, because I think the biggest obstacle to rationality is ego. And I think when you put yourself sort of in the center of what you're trying to say, when you try to make yourself look good or whatever, that's when you're most prone to errors.
Yeah.
All right, let's go look at it.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's like when you look at a polished window, you have a choice. You can either see out through the window, or you can see your reflection in the window. And I think if you are stuck on how you appear, then you're not going to see through the window.
That's a good one.
So,
that's deep, dude. I like that.
We also have to compete in the digital age too for people's attention. So just trying to make things like simple and short. That's what my editing process is like. I just delete sentences like this isn't really necessary. Get to the point to get your message out there.
Totally. And deleting words and sentences too. All right, Christina, give us the next one.
Munger's iron prescription. To determine how well you understand a debate, try to state the opposing view as convincingly as you can. If you can't state the opposing view at least as well as the people supporting it, then you shouldn't feel entitled to your own view.
Excellent. Excellent. I love that. Talk us through it.
Yeah, so this is from Charlie Munger, who unfortunately passed away a few months ago, but he was a fount of wisdom. And this idea that he had is one of my my primary heuristics. So I don't have an opinion on something unless I can state the opposing view at least as well as the opposite. And the reason for this is because obviously if you don't understand the opposing view, then how are you going to expect to argue against it? You know, you need to actually understand the view. Otherwise, all you're going to do is you're going to straw man them, and you're going to, you know, engage in many other sort of biases and fallacies. And so in order to prevent that, you need to have an honest understanding. And this is why I try to see wokeism from the perspective of the woke, because I think that that's the only way to argue against them. Otherwise, all we're going to do is we're just going to end up caricaturing their view, and we're going to be arguing against.
The reason one wouldn't do that is because their moral mind has overwritten their rational mind, right? Is they're so utterly convinced that something is true and that it's a moral good that they don't need to understand the other position, like throwing people in ovens. Like, what other position is there? So for them, maybe everything is the analog of throwing people in ovens.
Yeah. Well, I mean, sorry. Yeah.
No, you're right.
Okay. Yeah. So I think sort of one of the essences of standpoint theory, which is sort of this whole idea that there is ultimately that there isn't so much truth as there is power. Like truth is determined by who has the power. And so for the woke, it makes sense for them not to try to understand other points of view, because it isn't about truth. It's about power. You know, it's not about having good arguments. It's about convincing people. And so for them, it makes sense from their point of view, from their epistemology. It doesn't make sense for them to engage in this kind of, in Munger's iron prescription. But that's the difference between us and them, is that we are willing to understand them and they're not willing to understand us.
Yeah, that's the John Stuart Mill quotation. If he does not so much as now know what they are, he has no grounds for preferring either opinion. Sorry, Christina, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say it's easy for me to understand the woke because I was woke for about 8 months during the pandemic.
Yeah.
And I describe that. I try to think about how I got swept up in that. And I describe it as like, I compartmentalized my critical thinking skills, everything that I had learned in school and about rationality and skepticism. I compartmentalized it for some reason. And I was just convinced because it was like the bandwagon effect or the illusory truth effect, these things, like so many people, so many authorities were saying, this is real. We're experiencing a racism pandemic. Like, I just believed it. Everyone around me was saying the same thing. It was very easy for me to just accept this as true.
Yeah, 100% the same with me as well. I mean, I wouldn't say I was woke, but I was a socialist at one point. I was far left. And it was a very gradual process for me to sort of be completely divorced of my leftism. It took a long time.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So disorienting for a period of time.
Yeah. That's so interesting to me. That just goes to show that smart people can get hoodwinked too. I mean, I always thought the thing was completely fucking asinine from day one. So I never understood why anybody would believe any of it. It just seems so demonstrably idiotic. All right, Christina, let's go to the next one.
Survivorship bias. The info in your feed has been selected because it's surprising. It is a reflection not of the ordinary, but the extraordinary, not of reality, but of that which is uncharacteristic of reality. Remember this whenever your feed convinces you the world is crazy.
Excellent. Please.
Yeah. So, I sometimes I sort of check out these anti-woke accounts, like sort of libs of TikTok. And when I've spent, like an hour or something just going down this feed and just watching these videos, and, I actually begin to like I feel myself become more irrational, and I begin to feel like the woke are just taking over, and it makes me almost panic when I see all this stuff. And it sort of occurred to me that, hang on a second, when I'm seeing this highly curated feed, even though I know that it's curated, my primal brain gets fooled into thinking that this is indicative of reality, that this is literally all that's happening in the world, nothing else is happening. And so I become sort of hyper focused on one aspect. Like, if I see sort of 5 videos of drag queen story hour in a row, then suddenly I'm gonna, like, my primitive brain is gonna sort of think they're everywhere, they're surrounding me, they're gonna get me, I'll start having nightmares about drag queens. So it's a very dangerous thing that happens, like, where the world, like, even if you're aware of it, even if you're aware that you're seeing a curated feed, it can still affect you. It can still make you feel negative and miserable. And I think Sam Harris actually touched on this in one of his videos when he quit Twitter. I think it was called Twitter back then. Actually, no, it was. And he did this video on why he had quit Twitter, and he gave a few reasons, but one of them was that just browsing his feed made him hate humanity, because it was just all negative. It was just negative after negative, and it was just miserable sort of stuff. And it just basically, because even though Sam's a smart guy, so he was aware that this is all curated, that he's not seeing reality, but the primitive part of his brain was somehow being fooled into thinking this was reality, and it was making him hate humanity. It was making him just not want to. He almost thought that there was a civil war, and I think this is one reason why there's a lot of people who believe there's a civil war impending, because I've written about this. I call this Dramageddon. It's this idea that when you're online and you see all this conflict, this culture warring, your sort of brain gets fooled into thinking this is reality, that this is what's happening in the real world as well. But it instantly goes away the moment you step outside and you go into the streets, and you just start talking to people in the streets. You realize that all of the stuff that is completely filling your head online is not really going on very, very much in the real world.
Right.
It's not, it's not indicative. And this is not to say that there's not problems in the real world, that but it's just to say that they're not as all encompassing as social media would suggest.
Right. We saw this during like the Black Lives Matter era
absolutely.
in 2020, where we just constantly were seeing videos on our feed of, police shootings and things like that. And I think it was Michael Shermer that said it's important to look at trend lines instead of headlines, because, race relations have gotten much better in recent years, but you wouldn't know it from going on social media.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I could literally, Christina and I could talk to you for hours. This is so fascinating. This is, what you do in your work is exactly what I do in my work. And I think we approach it in a very similar but not identical way. And those degrees of difference to me are fascinating, that I'd like to explore at some point with you, because I think that there's so much to be gained. But I do want to keep going through the feed, if that's okay, because I think that listeners can take a lot out of that. All right, Reed, what's the next one? By the way, we were in Washington Square Park. Keep that up there, Reed. And we had a woman. We were doing Spectrum Street epistemology, and I was trying to figure out how much Reed's life was worth. And basically, Reed's life is worth less than 2 giraffes, but Reed's life is worth 5 anthills. But they're filled with ants, though. So I thought that's fascinating. So if you ever wondered.
I do love your street epistemology. I do watch it, actually. It's really cool. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Well, now we have a definitive answer to the question of what Reed's life is worth. We'll be posting those videos pretty soon. So, okay. All right, Christina, Wittgenstein's ruler.
Always ask yourself, what does the info suggest about the source of the info? If someone says everyone he meets is an asshole, the asshole is likely him. Equally, if an article outrages you, consider that it was crafted specifically to outrage you.
Yeah, so when I read the newspapers, or when I read sort of news outlets, I no longer just take what they're saying at face value. What I do immediately is I try to work out what they're trying to convince me of. Because I think once you do that, then it just makes it sort of creates this kind of distance between you and them, and you're able to sort of, in that distance, you're able to resist what they're trying to do to you. And so, I like to read newspapers that I disagree with. I sometimes read the New York Times.
Excellent. That's excellent.
But I don't read them for news. I read them to see what they're doing. I want to know what they're trying to convince the people of. And so I think that if you approach the news from that perspective, it just makes it a little bit harder for them to fool you. And it also allows you to understand a little bit more than just what's being reported, because you also want to understand why is it being reported. Because obviously we all know that the most important stories don't always get reported. It's what they want to report that gets reported. And there's always a reasoning behind it. There's always some sort of editorial decision behind why they chose these stories and not those stories. And so understanding that, I think, is critical. And it's just as important as understanding the news itself. Why do certain stories get traction and others not?
So let me ask you a question, a kind of a meta question about that. Why do you think it is that some people don't do or won't do or refuse to do any of the tips that you've laid out?
Because everybody's lazy, including me.
Really?
Daniel Kahneman, who probably has done more about, to sort of popularize the idea of cognitive biases and fallacies than anybody. He said that, I've spent my whole life studying cognitive biases and I'm still no better at avoiding them.
Yeah.
And I feel the same way. I write a lot about biases and logical fallacies and all that kind of stuff, but I'm still guilty of them. I am just as guilty as pretty much anybody else. And this is because in order to avoid these biases and these fallacies, you've got to be conscious constantly. And our brains are simply, they don't have the capacity to constantly be conscious of themselves. Metacognition is something that it requires a lot of cognitive resources, and you can't do it constantly. It's just not possible. And so that's why we need heuristics. That's why I try to rely on heuristics. And I'm pretty good at following heuristics. I've managed to train my brain to follow heuristics. Tell the audience what a heuristic is. So heuristics are these very entries that we're going through on this list. They're shortcuts in thinking that you can use to get to an approximation of truth. Think of them as rules of thumb. They're rules of thumb for thinking. And the reason people should have these or follow these or why? Because if you try to take the long route to the truth, you won't ever get there, because the brain is not designed for truth. It's designed for truth only insofar as it aids survival. Instrumental. It's not, instrumental.
Because people are tribal. You've said that before. Yeah.
People. That's one aspect of where we're irrational. And obviously the purpose of the brain is to help you survive and procreate. And so there's no need to understand things like philosophy. There's not much evolutionary need to understand philosophy. So for that reason, we can't take the wrong road to the truth. If we had bigger brains and we had better, more efficient energy consumption of our brains, then we might be able to. But we have to collapse the world to fit inside our minds.
You said
no, go ahead.
It's okay. You can go.
No, you go.
Well, you said that you managed to train your brain with heuristics. I feel like a lot of the messaging young people are getting today is that they aren't in control of their lives, and they don't realize that you can train your brain to do things. You can learn how to regulate your emotions. You aren't just sort of a witness to your life. You're in control of your life. And I really liked your articles about that in particular. I think people don't really realize how much control they have.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Agency is something that's been sort of deteriorating quite a bit. I mean, Jonathan Haidt has this brilliant piece where he talks about how the locus of control has gradually become externalized. So just for your audience, the locus of control is the degree to which you believe that your own decisions determine your destiny as opposed to external circumstances. So if you have an internal locus of control, then that means that you believe that your decisions determine your destiny. But if you have an external locus of control, then that means that your own decisions don't really play much of a part. And it's really your fate is up to whatever goes on in the external world. And there's been a gradual shift, and this can be shown through questionnaires that have been happening via census taking throughout the years, where we've seen a gradual, this is the article, great article. And it basically shows that this sort of externalization of locus of control coincides with a rise in depression, particularly amongst young teenage girls. And it's a very compelling argument.
Yes, it's especially for me from personal experience. I was one of those liberal girls with a lot of mental health issues when I was a teenager.
Yeah.
And learning that I had a sense of control was something, it was a hard lesson to learn, but through cognitive behavioral therapy techniques and stoicism that I discovered like late in my 20s, that I was able to sort of retrain my brain, that I didn't even realize I could do that.
Yeah, 100% the same with me as well. Because I used to suffer from depression and I had anxiety as well. And I also embraced stoicism, and it helped me tremendously. It's a world of difference. This is why I always say that when you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change.
Belief is so powerful.
Yeah.
Well, I could literally explore that statement for 10 hours. I find that so fascinating.
I know.
And I just don't want to go down that rabbit hole. I have to have you on again. Let's just keep, but I do want to keep, the reason I want to keep going through this is because I want people who listen to this to be left with things to help their reasoning and thinking. So that's why I want to do this. All right, Christina, streetlight effect.
The majority of the world's info is produced for the average human, and the average human isn't very smart. So avoid getting your info from popularity contests like top search results, trending algorithms, and New York Times bestseller lists, which you can buy, I think. If you have if you buy like 2,000 copies of a book in the first week or so, you automatically get on the New York Times bestseller list. I don't know if that's exactly true. I was told that.
I went to a conference with a guy who did that. He basically helps people put their book on the New York Times bestseller list. And the way he does that is they just buy a bunch of them up.
It's true. And they're very selective. I mean, because it's interesting because Rob Henderson recently released his biography, and his biography is a bestseller, and it sold a huge amount of copies.
Excellent.
But it's nowhere to be found. It's nowhere to be found on the New York Times bestseller list. And it's probably because Rob's obviously not ideologically aligned with the New York Times.
Correct. So, Peterson's book was left off the New York Times. Cynical Theory, Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay's book was left off the New York Times, even though I think that those are fast approaching, if you include all platforms, 600,000 copies at this point, which is 1% of books sell more than 5,000 copies. So that's staggering. All right, Reed, let's pull up the next one.
Popper's falsifiability principle. We try to protect our most cherished delusions from reality. So, for each of your beliefs, you should develop a clear idea of what would persuade you you're wrong. Otherwise, your belief is immune to reason, and it should arouse your suspicions.
That should be number one, in my opinion. But okay, keep going to explain this, because this is the core of my work. I would say if I could summarize my work in almost a single line, this would be it. Defeasibility.
So I think this is why I was originally very skeptical of the theory of sort of critical race theory, and in particular the idea of white fragility, because what I realized was that the idea of white fragility isn't falsifiable. Because if you question it, then you have white fragility. So it's circular. It's a circular argument, and even I can be accused of white fragility because there's internalized white fragility.
Right.
So nobody can question it, because by questioning it, you're proving the point. You're proving that people will react.
That's a kind of special pleading. I mean, I used to ask repeatedly my colleagues, why doesn't the same thing apply when you accuse someone of being a rhinoceros? Why isn't denial of the fact that you're a rhinoceros evidence of the fact that you're a rhinoceros? Like, why is it special pleading that it just... So that idea of disconfirmation or falsifiability, or in the moral realm, the epistemological realm, it's defeasibility. I think that's perhaps the most important principle that should govern one's even moral and epistemic lives, particularly epistemic lives.
Yeah, we run into that a lot in the gender world, a lot of circular, self-referential definitions and unfalsifiable claims.
Yeah, like the definition of woman and all that kind of stuff,
So let's relate what Christina just said, and we'll pull up a super chat in a second. Let's relate what Christina just said to what you just said, G. So in that case, among people who have domain-specific expertise, or at least think that they do, laziness wouldn't be the causal factor. That laziness couldn't be the explanatory reason for why they don't look up counter arguments. It has to be something else. And that something else, in my opinion at least, is morality. So it couldn't be laziness. I don't agree with Daniel on that.
Well, I think laziness might be one of the explanations for some people. I think people do things for different reasons. And so I think laziness could be one angle. But yeah, you're right. I mean, obviously, there is a moral component to this as well, a very significant moral component. And some people believe that even entertaining ideas that they disagree with is immoral.
Correct. And that many people who participate in critical social justice or in that orbit, they won't even think about, you mentioned my good friend, Michael Shermer. You know, he was doing a debate. He's very much pro-marriage, and he was doing a debate with Frank Turek, who's against, I'm pretty sure that's who it was. And it was protested. And Shermer's a master. He's like a genuinely excellent debater. But they didn't protest because they thought he was a bad debater or what have you. They protested because they thought the debate itself was illegitimate. And this is a time when those polls were not what they are now. So I found that interesting. All right, let's do a super chat, and then let's keep going down these so our listeners can. Howard Schoonover, $10. But don't we need axioms, unquestioned deontological beliefs?
Yes, we do. For most of us, that axiom is reason. And there's a beautiful sort of passage from C.S. Lewis, actually, that I'll just read out because I think it's very relevant to this. So this is basically from C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man. But you cannot go on explaining away forever. You will find that you have explained explanation itself away. You cannot go on seeing through things forever. The whole point of seeing through something is to see through it. It is good that the window should be transparent because the street or garden beyond it is opaque. How if you saw through the garden too? It is no use trying to see through first principles. If you see through everything, then everything is transparent. But a wholly transparent world is an invisible world. To see through all things is the same as not to see. So sorry for the lofty way in which I read that out. I tend to do that.
No, it's
sometimes.
good. No, it's good.
but I think it's a very good point there, where you can't see through everything. There has to be something that you see through that thing. And for us, that final thing is reason. We have to base it on something. It's reason. For some people, it might be God. So that we do have to take into account that we are basing everything on one axiom. And a common argument that I see against rationalists is that if the idea that reason didn't evolve for truth, but for survival is true, then that's a self-defeating argument. It means that we cannot depend on reason to tell us the truth. But I think that this is a faulty argument. I think that we can depend on reason. And the reason is that we have what is known as veridical truth, and which is what you referred to earlier as instrumental truth. And this is the idea that we have the basic building blocks of truth, because if we didn't, we wouldn't be able to survive. Because what is truth? Truth is ultimately your model of reality, and it's having a model of reality that is in alignment with reality. So the way I use it is I think of truth as that which allows you to predict the future, because only truth can allow you to predict the future. There's nothing else that can allow you to do that consistently. You can get it right by chance, but the only way to predict the future is through truth, is if you have the truth. And that's why we evolved truth, because in order to survive, you need to be able to predict the future. If you can't do it, you're not going to survive for very long. So when I say predict the future, I mean that you should know that if you jump off a cliff, you're going to fall and die. That's predicting the future. So we need to know the future in that respect. And that's why we can depend on the truth, because the truth is based on the basic sort of evolutionary impulse of survival. So, yeah.
You've said before that you didn't identify with the left anymore because you care about reality and they're more interested in furthering their causes and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, my disillusionment with the left is a very, very long story. I mean, it goes back to when I was undercover in Luton and I was studying jihadists, which is a whole other story. I won't talk about that now.
Yeah, we're going to have you back on. We're going to have you back on, and
yeah, that's a very interesting story. Yeah, we'll talk about that another time. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Before we do the next one, so I'm thinking about that in terms of first principles. Maybe I guess you could look at rationality or reason as a first principle. I've looked at it as the grounding necessary for the precondition of first principles. And so, but I'm completely fine with thinking about it as I mean, that's the kind of thing that about which one would have a conversation. All right, let's go to the next principle because I want our listeners to really take something out of this they can use. All right, Christina, 7.
Anti-routine. Indoctrination requires the repetition of routine. So to avoid being brainwashed, periodically switch up your news sources so you alternate between outlets of clashing stances. The more mercurial your news consumption, the greater your resistance to manipulation. That's good.
So the whole sort of point of big tech right now is to predict your behaviors. Because when they can do that, then they have power over you. They can control your behaviors. They can sell things to you. They can essentially make you do whatever they want. And that's why I'm very conscious of the ways that I browse the internet, because I know that every time I create a routine online, the algorithms record that and they begin to create a model of me. And once the big tech have a model of me, then they can start shaping my behavior. And this is something that I became privy to when I was working in tech. I realized that, for instance, if I watch certain YouTube videos about something, let's say if I watch YouTube videos about Ben Shapiro, for instance, then it's going to start recommending me more and more Ben Shapiro videos. And eventually I'm going to find myself in this rabbit hole of just Ben Shapiro everywhere. So this doesn't just apply to algorithms. It also applies to the media, where if you watch the same kinds of things over and over again, you have algorithms in your brain. And these algorithms also become sort of accustomed to your behaviors. So if you generate a habit, if you create a habit of always reading the New York Times, then your brain is going to start to sort of become wired almost to read the New York Times. You'll start to expect certain things. The way I look at the New York Times is I look at it as a kind of TV serial. So in the old days, you had TV series and you had a cliffhanger and it would tell you in next week's episode, will they survive, and all this. And it's almost like with New York Times, it's almost like an ongoing narrative where it's about, they have several different narratives, but usually what they do is they'll try to get you interested in one thing so that you'll continue to read about it.
So let me ask you a question. I'll overshare if that's okay. Sure. So I don't like Instagram. I'm never on Instagram. I used to never be on Instagram. And then Instagram figured out that I like jujitsu videos, these little short jujitsu videos. And now I'm like watching Instagram jujitsu videos constantly. It figured me out. It's got my number. But couldn't that then be a good thing in some sense? Because I want to rewire my brain. So if I'm in that situation, I can do that move, or am I thinking about that wrong?
Yeah, absolutely. If you want to create a good habit, then the best way to do that is through repetition. Absolutely. But what I'm talking about here is not about creating good habits. It's about your information browsing habits. And if you are constantly just getting the same news from the same sources, you're going to gradually be convinced of their narrative. Because they do it very subtly. They do it very subtly over time. And I have firsthand experience of this, because one of the reasons why I became a leftist was because I used to read The Guardian all the time. Because at university, that was the newspaper that my friends, all used to read. So I thought, okay, I'll start reading. So I just started reading The Guardian, and only The Guardian. I wouldn't read any of the newspapers.
Oh, God.
I didn't have time.
Brain damage.
And that gradually poisoned my mind, and it made me think that, all of these things. And so, I've seen this happen with people as well. I've seen it happen with some of my friends where they'll constantly get their news from one source, and eventually they start to think like the writers of that source, or probably more accurately, they start to think like the editors of that source. And it's a natural thing, because we grow accustomed to whatever repeats whatever, we're repeatedly exposed to. And the same is true of information. If we constantly repeat the same information, we will gradually be convinced of it.
That happened to me during the pandemic. In the very beginning of the pandemic, I had the news on every single day, all day, trying to see updates on what was going on with the evolving situation. And then I just started, it became a habit, and I just got my news from CNN and NBC, and that formed my beliefs on so many different other things. And that's kind of how I got sucked into social justice stuff.
Yeah.
I think it's a good thing to browse things like the New York Times and CNN, but only if you don't make a habit of it. Like, so if I read the New York Times on Monday, then I'll read the Wall Street Journal on Tuesday, so it's good to just sort of be as diverse in your information browsing habits as possible, I think.
All right. Excellent. Let's do the next one.
Opinion
Christina?
lock. We find it hard to change our minds as we think it makes us look weak or stupid. So resist the urge to rush out an opinion, as once you've declared your stance, your ego won't easily let you switch, especially when there's a public record of your opinion history. Oh,
excellent. Let's whip through these. Tell me talk to us about that one.
Yeah, so I think I've sort of witnessed this with certain people online, where they will sort of hastily rush out an opinion, though, because social media rewards impulsive behavior, and a lot of people will just say something, emotionally charged, and they'll just say something, and it will later turn out that they were wrong when the actual information comes out. But because they wanted to be first, they wanted to be the first person to say something, they'll say it really quickly. And so what will then happen is now they're faced with a choice. They're faced with a choice of either they can publicly admit that they were wrong, and very few people, in my experience, have the strength to do that, or they can double down on it and try to find a way to justify what they said earlier. And I think some people even see it like a kind of game where they try to see, what argument can I make that is going to justify this complete crazy shit that I said earlier, And so they will just engage in these mental gymnastics, and they will, say, but I said this, but look, you misinterpreted it. What I actually meant was this. And so you see a lot of people squirming in that way online. And so I think it's something that people should be wary of, is that, we all have egos. Everybody's got an ego. I try to be as humble as I can, but I have an ego as well. I want people to think that I'm smart. I don't want people to think I'm stupid. And so, obviously I've got to be aware of that, and I've got to be aware of my own ego.
Can I pause you? So you want people to think you're smart. Okay. So there's a whole infrastructure here. So you want people to think you're smart. You also have an ego, like Christina, like myself, even like Reed. So, but wouldn't the best way to convey that you're smart and that you're epistemically humble be to change your mind, particularly in real time? Like, I said this, I made a mistake, I was wrong, but the culture is so recalcitrant. It's so,
100%.
or am I?
No, you're 100% right. And look, there are people that I really respect because they publicly changed their mind. For instance, I really respect Claire Lehman because she has publicly changed her mind. She's not wrong often. It's very rare when she gets things wrong. But when she does get things wrong, she's one of the few people that will publicly state that she got it wrong. And that, for me, makes her seem smarter in my eyes. And not just smarter,
RFK too.
Yeah. Okay.
Christina, RFK changed his mind on the gender stuff, right?
I don't know. I don't really like him.
Oh, okay. Well, he changed his mind on the gender stuff.
I thought you were going to say he changed his mind on his autism and vaccine conspiracy theory.
No, I didn't do that. Okay, let's see if we can keep cranking. Oh, before we do that, Reed, let's do the super chat. Trade Bear $9.99. The people must finally stand up and demand more transparency and control from big tech. We are the customer, not the product. What do you think, G?
I agree with that. Yeah, I mean, factually speaking, we are the product. Unfortunately, unless we're paying for the product, we are the product. But I completely agree with that gentleman's sentiment. I think that we do need to hold big tech to account because we're letting them get away with far too much right now. And the reason that we're doing that is because they make life so convenient for us and so comfortable. Like there's this whole thing, I don't know if you remember, but there was a whole thing about people stealing our data, and there was a massive furore about it about 10 years ago. when Facebook, like was stealing people's data openly and selling it on, and people forgot about that, and people don't care about it anymore because Facebook just provided too much utility. And so we need to stop being so comfortable and realize that this is not good for us in the long term.
Again, I'm not an expert in I'm not a coder. Isn't one way to mitigate some of those risks to just use, for example, Brave browser?
Yeah, you can use any tech you want. You can use Onion Router, you can use Proton Mail, you can use all these different things. But the fact is that there are network effects involved here. So if you're using these alternate sort of platforms, you're not going to have the same advantages as somebody who's using one of the mainstream ones. For instance, if you don't have a Google account, then you can't sign up for Google Meet. Well, you have to.
I never use Google ever.
Yeah.
I mean,
I'm gradually weaning myself off it, but it's very useful. It's useful because it integrates so many different things. You've got Google Documents, you've got Google Meet, and you can mix and match, and you can take things from here and there, and there's so much you can do if you do use Google. They have made it very useful. And then there's the network effects. But then obviously, as you point out, it comes with a downside as well, where you're putting yourself at their mercy. So it's a case of how much is the platform worth to you? Is it worth your data? Because that's what you're paying for. If you're not paying with money, you're paying with your data.
All right, Reed, let's keep going here.
The never-ending now. We're always chasing the latest info, but this tends to be junk, whose main selling point is novelty and not quality. Instead of the new, seek info that stood the test of time, classic literature, replicated studies, proven theorems.
Not many of those replicated studies anymore, right?
Yeah, unfortunately not, no. But I mean, yeah, this harks back to our evolutionary past. And obviously we have a novelty bias, where we're sort of attracted to new information because in our history, this enabled us to survive. So, obviously if you heard a rustling in the forest, that could be a tiger or an enemy tribe. And so, that's it. Yeah, a type 1 error. And so we have this novelty bias. But the problem is that new information in the digital age is not useful anymore, not necessarily useful anymore. And so what's happened is that the companies have exploited our novelty bias and, what some people might call shiny object syndrome, where they've taken our sort of this preference that we have for new things, and they've exploited it by churning out clickbait that is rushed out, because it obviously, in order to be new, it has to be rushed out. It has to come out as fast as possible. But the downside of putting things out fast as possible is it's going to be inaccurate, because in order to, you need to really take the time to make sure you've got the right message before you publish it. So a lot of people, a lot of journalists, a lot of media outlets, what they will do is, in order to be the first to report something, they'll just rush it out as fast as they can. They'll say, okay, hit send straight away. And influencers do this as well, where they want to be the first to say something. So they will quick, without thinking, they'll just push it out.
Yeah. And then they get details wrong. And then the one side will fact check the other about the details they got wrong and turn it into a whole thing.
Exactly. And information usually is highly perishable. It usually has a very short shelf life because it's constantly being updated and more information is constantly becoming available. So if you only live in the now, if you only live in the next sort of 24 hours and just looking for information that's immediately coming through on your feed, you're going to get things wrong because it's all stuff that's rushed out. And that's why I say that, you want to look at Lindy information. So the Lindy effect is this idea that the lifetime of something is roughly proportional to its current existence. So it's current lifetime. So let me rephrase that. Its future lifetime is roughly proportional to its current existence. I got it. And so, and so this is because stuff that's lasted for a long time tends to be robust. It tends to be able to weather the fickleness of fashions and the erosion of eons. And so it's good to look at tried and tested information. This is not always true. So for instance, Christianity has lasted a very, very long time, but that doesn't mean that it's true. It just means that it's got some utility. It's got some use. But you know, that most information, if it's lasted a long time, it usually has some worth of some value. You know, so that's why it's usually good to pay attention to it. Why does it exist? You know, that's what we should be asking. And so, yeah.
Cool. One of the things that you put out, let's do number 10, and then I want to go to that one of my favorite tweets. And then I'm going to ask you if you could tell us what you think your favorite things, what you've learned out of this. All right, Christina, let's do 10.
Journaling. To practice clear thinking, practice clear writing. You only become fully aware of your beliefs when you express them, so periodically write them down. Laying your thoughts out on paper will reveal your reasoning and expose its errors, deepening your understanding. I was a big journaler.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think this is just something that I've learned from experience as a writer. I used to have so many theories and so many ideas about the world before I was a writer. And I thought that they were unassailable. I thought they were sort of incontrovertibly true. But what happened was that once I started putting them down to paper and actually exploring them formally, I realized that there were flaws and blind spots that I'd missed in them. And that was because when you lay it out on paper, you actually see the ways that the arguments connect to each other. And you see the assumptions that you have to make in order to believe something. And you know, the language is a very powerful thing. When you phrase things in certain words, they become real in a way that they don't when they're just in your head.
Right.
And so this is why I don't trust any thought that I haven't consigned to paper. If the only sort of beliefs that I truly trust are the ones that I've really written about at length. And those are the ones that I'm most confident about. But the ones that I haven't, if I haven't put them down on paper, I don't trust them.
Do you have a physical journal you write out of?
I've got a Word document that I write all my stuff in, you know, so I usually just type on that. Yeah. It would be nice to do it the old-fashioned way, but I'm too lazy for that.
Does that mean we're going to get a book soon?
We will be, yes.
Yay.
We're hopefully getting a few. Yeah.
Why aren't you teaching? I think college students would be a lot better off if they were reading your Substack and watching
thank you.
Peter's channel.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I would. I don't know if I'd be very, very good at that, but I kind of just sort of, to be honest, it's a bit of a weird one. I'm not really qualified, I think, to teach students. I don't have a formal education in psychology. You know, my education's in computer science, which I don't really talk much about. But I mean, you know, I don't think I would ever be able to get a job in a university because of that, because I don't have the qualifications.
No, but like writing a curriculum about critical thinking and rationality, I mean, that's something like high school students should be required to learn.
Well, I mean, I'm working on a book that I hope will help educate people. So there's that, you know, we'll see how it goes.
So what have you learned from all of these lists, all of these thinking tips, all of these, what have you learned?
So I've learned something quite amusing, which is when I point out these cognitive biases or these logical fallacies, what will happen is this happens without fail, is I'll get left-wing activists who will enter my replies and they'll say, oh yeah, this cognitive bias here, this is why right-wingers believe what they believe. And then I'll also get right-wingers who will reply to say that this is why left-wingers believe what they believe. Mm-hmm. But in no cases will they admit that this is why they believe what they believe.
Yeah.
So this is a big sort of paradox for me and a big quandary that I find myself in, where the more I try to talk about these biases, the more people weaponize them in the culture war, and they use them to beat down their enemies, but not to self-reflect. You know, so for instance, if I point out confirmation bias, for instance, you know, if I point out confirmation bias, then left-wingers will use my tweet and they'll retweet it and they'll say, oh, this is why Trump supporters believe this, blah, blah, blah. And then I'll get like, you know, right-wingers will go, oh, this is why Biden supporters believe this, blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. And so that happens so often that it's scary. I actually find it quite scary. Yeah. And I'm trying to find a way. Yeah. And I'm trying to find a way to bridge this, because I think that this is really the core of the issue. Christina, you mentioned tribalism earlier, and I think that tribalism is really the the sort of crux. It's the thing that everything else depends on. As long as you favor your own tribe, you will always succumb to biases over the truth. And so we need
100%.
to stop people being so tribalist, I think.
100%.
Yeah. So that's my aim now, is to try to find some way to do that. I don't know how, but I'm trying.
It's not enough, because I noticed in your tweet threads you say you and your, like, you want people to self-reflect, but it's probably not getting through to a lot of people that they need to look into themselves and see if they do these things and try to catch them and try to correct them. And it's not easy to change the way you think if you're prone to these kinds of biases. It takes a lot of work, and I don't think a lot of people like work or working on themselves or changing the way they think. But it's very necessary.
Yeah, Reed is going to pull up something, the epistemology of democracy, and this idea of my side bias, little piece in there about that's the one thing that's most difficult to overcome. And I think in my last book, I wrote that the only thing people want more than to be right is to belong, is to be. I know the word community is so it's just used in it's so overused, but people want to be members of a community. They want to be loved. They're more interested in being loved and finding that social approbation than they are in what's true or in being right. And I was thinking, like, what would the intervention that one could design to help one favor truth, which the only thing I could think of is you'd have to have some kind of associate that, rewire the mind to associate that with a feeling state that has more gravitas or more internal self-worth and belonging and being loved. And I can't fathom that would be the case.
Is the answer becoming more individualist rather than group dynamic?
Well, I mean, that could probably alleviate some of the problems, but it would bring some of its own problems, because if everybody's atomized, then people also begin to behave in attention-seeking behaviors in order to have some connection, social connection. So, you know, if you have a very atomized culture, as we see today, then you have a lot of people feigning sympathy, which, you know, is sort of why perhaps we have this kind of epidemic of people wanting to appear sick. This is something that will interest you, Christina.
Yes.
And I think, you know, a lot of it's because people want connection. And so they begin to act irrationally in order to try to get connection. So individualism, I don't think is going to solve all the problems. I think maybe what we can do, I mean, Richard Dawkins had this idea where, I mean, he had a very cringeworthy name for it, which was Brights, but it was a very good idea overall, which is that we should have a community of people who are dedicated to rational thought and to bettering themselves epistemologically.
I think that was Dennett, by the way.
Oh, okay. Right, yeah.
I mean, humanism, secular humanism.
Humanism is more of a sort of an ethical framework, I think, isn't it? I think this is more of an epistemological framework. So it's something that's probably akin to rationalism, but a sort of organized rationalism, where, you know, where we don't judge people if they get things wrong, but the goal is to improve thinking. And if we could somehow cultivate a culture that revolves around helping people be more rational and having that as an actual community, not just, you know, some vague online subculture, but like actual community where people meet up in person and actually talk about things that they got wrong and how they improve their thinking. And, you know, maybe, I mean, it's a bit of a fancy idea, and I think that it does maybe have some vulnerabilities in that it could probably lead to its own kind of tribalism. But I think that that's probably one of the best ideas that I've heard so far, because there's a sweet spot between being compassionate and having a community and being rational and being cold. And I think if we're completely robots, if we're just focused only on being rational, we can't develop a movement, because nobody's interested in that. Nobody just wants to be coldly rational. People want to belong to something, as you pointed out, Peter. And so we need to give them something to belong to, as well as trying to teach them how to think. So how do we create that sweet spot between making something welcoming to people, but not tribal? So I like the idea that.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, you go ahead. Go ahead.
I just say I like the idea that we sort of create an idea based around just improving our own thinking. So, and this is happening online in certain subcultures, you know, where sort of the less wrong movement online, where they try to focus on their own mind and trying to improve their own mind, but they get help from others to do it. So, you know, if I make a mistake in my reasoning, I can write about it to other people and to prevent them from making the same mistake as me. So that cultivates humility because we're writing about our own mistakes. We're not pointing out other people's mistakes, you know. So there's that humility. There's that lack of sort of competition, because if you have a competition to try and be right, that's the beginning of the end for that movement. So it's more about, I was wrong about this. This is what I did to make it right. Don't make the same mistake as me. And if everybody does this, then we can try to create this kind of this movement, this small community of people trying to improve their own thinking and helping others to do it in the process.
Yeah, two things unrelated. Tim Urban has this idea that he's a Wait But Why guy. He's become a buddy of mine. He has this idea that cool he's a super good dude, fantastic human being, fun to eat with too. But he has this idea that when you're in a conversation, when you're in an online community, just a few people can just poison everything and just derail it and make it wickedly nasty. And unlike Elon Musk, I have taken the opposite track and I just block. And that just radically increases the quality of conversation. And I don't have people who they're just not, I really don't like the Christian phrase, but I just can't seem to think of one that's more apropos. They're just not good faith actors. They just want to just stain and contaminate and destroy. And my question to you is a little bit of a curveball question. If we developed a super intelligent artificial, an AI, like a super intelligence, and this super intelligence, and you knew it was a super intelligence because it would do, you know, it could beat Go, it could, you know, develop quantum tunneling. I mean, whatever it is, like, you know, cure, you know, bladder cancer, etc. And this super intelligence told you that there are some principles of rationality and some, you know, like fallacies and some ways of thinking that do not strike you as reasonable or rational at all. They may not be totally irrational, but would you accept those as true?
They would have to be self-evident.
They were not not only were they not self-evident, even after thinking about them, you couldn't figure it out. You couldn't figure out why these are principles of rationality.
What reason would I have to trust this super intelligence? Because just because it's super intelligent doesn't mean it's super honest.
Because it has done pretty extraordinary things in other domains, medicine, telecommunications, etc.
And I couldn't ask it why. This is presuming I wouldn't be able to ask it for an explanation.
Okay, let's say that you ask it why, and it tells you that you would need to develop an entire language, which your meat brain, as Nick Bostrom calls it, that which your meat brain would not be capable of developing.
In that case, I would not listen to it, because if it's that complicated, then it's not going to be useful to me, because I'm limited to my brain. I don't have a supercomputer for a brain, so I can't make use of what it's telling me. I can make use of it. So, you know, there's this divorce between what it thinks is right and what my brain thinks is right. And obviously I have to go by what my brain thinks is right in everyday life. I can't comprehend what this thing is trying to tell me. So there's no point in me trying to. It would be like me trying to work out the distance between two stars on the other side of the galaxy. It's just completely beyond any of my capabilities. So there's no need for me to worry about it. You know, I have to go with what my brain is capable of. And so, yeah, I would tell it to fuck off.
Christina, do you have any thoughts?
AI conversations are a little too abstract sometimes for me.
Yeah, they're
for me
very
too.
abstract. For me too. Yeah, I still don't understand. I listened to this Shermer podcast with Nick Bostrom, and I mean, I read Superintelligence, but I haven't read his most recent book, and I find that guy to be just on another level. Like,
yeah,
I like to deal with now problems instead of future problems.
Yeah,
We have a lot going on
easier
right
to
now.
grasp. Yeah, and there is a lot to go. Yeah, there is. We've got our plate full.
All right, Reed, do we have any super chats? You wrote one thing up, one post, a tweet that I really liked. Let's do the tweet and then the super chat, because I just think that's so interesting. If you really want to find the flaws in your arguments, imagine they were made by the person you hate most. I love that. I love it. Explain it to us, please.
Yeah, so there was an experiment that was conducted basically with Israelis and Palestinians. And this experiment, so this is where I got this idea from. So this experiment was basically, it was a proposal for a peace plan between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And it was basically shown to Israelis. But what happened was that the source of the message, the source of the proposal was initially given to be the Israeli government, and then it was given to be by the Palestinians. And when it was given to be by the Israeli government, the Israelis agreed with the proposal. But when they were told that it came from the Palestinian people, then they disagreed with the proposal. It was the exact same message both times. So what this shows is that people's sort of perception of a message is affected by who they think created that message. And I think we can use this in our own lives, because I kind of noticed it myself, where if I don't like somebody, or if I think that they're irrational and I read their work, I'm very good at spotting flaws in it. But if it's a friend that I'm reading, I kind of will interpret everything in the most charitable way. And I think everybody does this. I mean, we have this kind of, this fundamental attribution error, where we interpret our friends in the best possible ways and we interpret our enemies in the worst. Yeah. And so I think if you imagine that what you wrote was written by the person that you dislike most, then that's going to activate that bias in your brain. But you can use that bias. And it's something that I'm very interested in, where we can hijack our own biases and joyride them and use them for our own purposes. This is something that interests me quite a lot, because it's a way of sort of turning a liability into an asset.
Like a cheat code.
And improving your communication.
Yeah, that's it.
What do you think the most important principle one can follow to improve one's thinking? What is it?
Humility. I think humility is the most important, because, as I said before, rationality, the greatest obstacle to rationality is ego. And so if you're humble, then you'll be willing to change your mind when you are proven wrong or when you find new information. You won't dig your heels in when you're wrong. It's the only way you can truly improve and become more rational is if you have the humility to do so. So humility is, for me, the most important thing. I also think curiosity is important, because if you're curious, then you have the capability to learn more. And that's what everybody needs to do. We all need to learn more. As soon as you stop being curious and you become certain, that's the death of thought. That's when you stop thinking.
Yeah. A friend of mine, Pine Creek, said something super interesting that's been haunting me for months now. Do you think that less intelligent people are less capable of entertaining hypotheticals?
Possibly, yeah. I mean, there are certain hypotheticals that require a lot of imagination, that require a lot of cognitive processing. And so if somebody doesn't have a very powerful imagination, it might be beyond them to really envision something that's not true.
You said before, intelligent people affiliated with an ideology are more dangerous than stupid people.
Yeah, because being better at reasoning makes them better at rationalizing. If you are intelligent, then you can engage in Olympic level mental gymnastics and convince yourself of pretty much anything you want. So so I wrote this piece called "Why Smart People Believe Stupid Things," and there's been quite a lot of research by Dan Kahan and others, which shows that people, and
why people believe weird things. That
one of my favorite books. Yeah,
that was like my first introduction into science and skepticism and critical thinking.
It's a very, I think, important idea, and it's one of the reasons why academia is the way it is. I think it was. I think, to paraphrase George Orwell said it, and Thomas Sowell said a different version of it, but it's something like it was an idea so stupid that only an academic could believe it.
Correct.
And it's basically because there are some delusions that require a great deal of intelligence in order to believe, because you have to convince yourself of completely counterintuitive ideas.
That's my piece that Reed just posted, deluded departments. My colleagues lost their minds about that. Contemporary sophistry that's poisoning academic. I talked about how groups of smart people, and academics are mostly midwits, but groups of semi-smart people who get together become mouthpieces for the orthodoxy, and philosophy is not only less susceptible to that, it's actually more susceptible. So they become
your piece about idea laundering was great, actually.
Oh, thanks.
Yes, that's so important to understand.
Because that's so, it is essential to understand, because it is really how these crazy ideas become legitimized through sort of couching them in academic jargon and basically making them, like, disguising opinions as knowledge.
Yes, your concept, the Woozle effect, recently. And you tagged my article that I wrote on the gender medicine citation cartel.
That's great piece.
Yeah, let's talk about that citation cartel, because I've been screaming about that for a long time. Not only did nobody listen to me, but people got upset with me. I can tell you exactly why they became upset, because they themselves were it's rather obvious. They were publishing in low-ranked journals. They were kind of gaming the system. So that, Christina, talk very briefly about the citation cartel, and then I want to ask G how the citation cartel and the corruption of peer-reviewed literature and the replication crisis now just found in economics, how that affects the way people think about things. So what's the citation cartel?
Well, a citation cartel is when you have a group of researchers that kind of collude together to inflate the number of citations their research paper gets, so that it'll be higher ranking and they'll gain more prestige. And it sometimes can lead to, like, their university getting millions more in funding, depending on how many citations they get. So
it's big in math.
Yes. Yeah. And there's like countries that, had no good research in math that are now, for some reason, considered highly influential because of the manipulation that they've been doing.
The whole system is broken and needs to be burned to the ground. All of it.
Yes.
Literally all of it. Burn it all down. Start anew. Okay, real quick before we go, we're running up against some hard deadlines. Real quick, let's do the super chat. Trade bear again, $9.99. Who will be the first to say that social media on balance is a giant pile of garbage? On balance.
Trade-offs.
The way I look at it,
I think it's trade-offs.
I always say that social media it depends on how you use it, right? So if you use it, like if you don't curate your feed, for instance, it's the worst information on the internet. It's literally the worst source of information you can get. An uncurated feed is hell on earth, right? In terms of the information. But if you have a well-curated feed, if you are very careful about only following people that you think are rational and that are open-minded and that are willing to, again, be humble and curious, if you follow those kinds of people, then I think social media can actually be the best source of information on the internet. I'm very, very mindful now of sort of what I allow into my head. I never check my Twitter timeline, like just, casually, because not until I've actually curated my feed. But normally what I do is I will go onto specific pages of people and I will read what they've written. And I find it's a brilliant source of information for that. So it all comes down to how you use it. If you use it the way that the big tech giants want you to use it, then absolutely it is a big pile of garbage. But if you use it in a more methodical and careful way, and you use it only to find the kind of information that you want to find, then it's brilliant. It's a godsend.
I met Christina that way. I met you that way.
Yeah,
I've met interfaced with many people through X now, or formerly Twitter. So I don't think I think it depends. I agree. It depends. I use it. Is that your Christina? Is that your line too?
Yeah, I'm very selective about who I let into my mind space. And that's something I've had to sort of learn and curate as I gotten older, about who I spend time with. And who I give my attention to, because there's a lot of people online who want your attention and want you to engage in fights and things like that. And it's just ignore, just block them. Don't give it to them.
We're coming up against a hard out. Where can people find you?
So I'm on Substack. My website is gurwinder.blog. I'm also on Twitter, and that's G_S_BHOGAL at Twitter. But the best way to do it is to just type my name into Google, and it should bring up the results.
Great. Well, we really appreciate you being on the show, and
it's been a pleasure to be here.
And
I know. I wish we could just talk longer.
I know, right?
Yeah, it's really getting into it. Yeah,
there's
it
so
feels
much
like we were just beginning. Yeah.
We'll have you on, and I want to talk about next time we have you on. I want to talk about reason and rationality. Also, not only tools to improve one's thinking, but ways that we can really do some deep dives to kind of clean, for epistemological hygiene, to kind of clean out the crap that we've accumulated over time, because very few people talk about that. Okay. Thank you so much for joining us, G. Keep your monitors and everything on. And thanks again to Reed, whose life is worth 5 anthills. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Just 5, less than 2 giraffes. That's Reed.
Wow.
Thank you for watching. Everything we do is under the umbrella of the National Progress Alliance, nationalprogressalliance.org. It's a nonprofit, independent 501c3. Your generous donations keep us going and keep fueling content like this. So please help us out. Make a donation. We very much appreciate it. Thank you.